Okay. This is the Happiness PhD project with Jackson Kirchis. I'm here today with Ryan Meachen. He's an associate research fellow at the Leadership and Happiness Laboratory at the Harvard Kennedy School Center for Public Leadership, visiting Fulbright Scholar from New Zealand, where he is currently a PhD student in organizational behavior. He has an MBA from Victoria Wellington School of Business and Government, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Geography and Public Policy. Ryan's research focuses on how individuals fulfill their potential by actualizing their ideal selves and the factors in organizational environments which either hinder or enable self actualization. So, more broadly, his teaching and research interests focus on the psychology of human potential, happiness, and leadership. Thank you, Ryan. And did I say your last name correctly?
Yeah, you nailed it. Ryan Meachen, that's the one. You're
All
good.
right.
I sometimes get like these weird pronunciations. Like there was this one time someone asked, pronounced my last name as Ryan Meachen. It's like, man, chill out. It's just like Meachen. It's pretty basic. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's get into this conversation. I'm excited to be here. So as you've maybe seen, and for those listening, right, our mission, I call it the Happiness PhD project because it's really just my spirit of being a happiness nerd and student that I've been wanting to learn and study. And a big part of this is, to kind of study, but also then share insights from the art and science of happiness to help advance happiness both on the individual and larger collective level. So it seems you have had maybe a similar career, similar spirit in taking what we might think of as happiness, human flourishing, positive psychology research, and turning it into impact. So could you maybe share for those listening just your sort of origin story and background?
Oh man, the old supervillain origin story, eh? Okay, we'll see how it goes. So yeah, I grew up in New Zealand in a pretty little area on the east coast of the North Island called Hawke's Bay. And I guess I had a little bit of a meandering path to where I'm ending up now in terms of being based here at Harvard on a Fulbright scholarship at Harvard's Happiness and Leadership Lab and doing my PhD in self-actualization. I never thought that this is where would end up. And to be honest, I still saying that sort of stuff aloud kind of seems a little bit surreal to me. Um, but what really inspired me, I guess, at the beginning of my career and my studies and what I wanted to do long term was back in my little hometown in New Zealand. I recognized that there were some pretty stark socioeconomic disparities across the city. On the west side of my city, where my grandparents have lived for the last 50 years, is a suburb that got the short end of the stick, so to say, socioeconomically. And then on the east side of my city, my hometown is one of the most affluent suburbs in regional New Zealand. And the reason that shapes, I guess, what I'm studying is because I always had like a really stark awareness of, I guess, the haves and the have-nots in my city. And when I went to Victoria University of Wellington in my undergraduate years, I started working in student accommodation as what we call an RA, which is like, the senior students that help run the halls of residence where students stay. And I noticed that despite Wellington being 4 hours away from my hometown, those socioeconomic differences showed up in terms of which students had the opportunity from my hometown to come to university or not. So I always had an awareness about these socioeconomic discrepancies, but it really shocked me to see how they showed up 400 kilometers south, 4 hours down the road, in terms of which students got to fulfill their potential by coming to university and which didn't. And that really got me starting to think about, well, how can we, create the conditions, whether it's in cities, whether it's in communities, whether it's in societies, whether it's in organizations that enable people to be able to fulfill their potential and to be able to live happy and fulfilling lives. So I'm really interested in that interaction between, the individual and also the environment that we're operating in terms of being able to fulfill our potential. I never really thought that I would be doing a PhD. I remember walking away from my last exam as a part of my undergraduate studies and honestly thinking to myself, you know, is it all good to swear or should I censor myself? Okay, okay. I remember walking down the hill from Victoria University of Wellington being like, fuck that, I'm never going back to university. You know what I mean? My undergraduate studies sucked. Um, but I always felt at the back end of my undergraduate studies that I didn't do, I, I did a disservice to myself. I didn't put my whole spirit into it. I had something more to give. I still had potential to express or fulfill. And so I ended up going back to Victoria University and doing an MBA. Now, as you said when you're doing the introduction, my undergraduate studies was originally in geography and public policy, and the reason it was because my rock star dream was to be the mayor of my little hometown in New Zealand, because I wanted to be able to, you know, influence my little city back home in New Zealand in a way that enabled people, no matter what side of the city you're from, to live a happy life and fulfill their potential by designing environments that enable people to do so. And so I went back to university and I did an MBA at the Victoria University of Wellington. And the first class that I took was in organizational behavior. And this is just basic organizational behavior, but it made so much sense to me and it completely shifted how I think about these things. I remember the professor standing up and saying, when it comes to organizational environments, how people behave in organizations are always a function of the individual and the environment that they're operating in as well. And it's how those two things interact together that shapes our experiences, that shapes our behavior too. And given this kind of origin story that I'm sharing with you about how I had this awareness about how the environment of my city was my hometown was influencing the factors of who got to go to university or not. Like this, I had this penny drop moment. And from that basis, I really fell in love with organizational behavior. I fell in love with learning about how individuals enact purpose and do meaningful work and they lead individuals and they try to make a positive impact in the world and create high performing teams. It was just a class that really spoke to me. And so I anticipated that all of my MBA was going to be like that, was going to really light a fire within me. And lo and behold, in the next semester, I did accounting and economics, and that didn't quite strike my heart in the same way that organizational behavior did. So that's what took me to doing a PhD. I knew I wanted to do a PhD in organizational behavior, but I was also really interested in studying something like motivation or something that helped me make sense of me kind of figuring out my own pathway and where I wanted to go and being committed and engaged to walking a particular pathway in life. And prior to starting my PhD, I read a book by Scott Barry Kaufman called Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization. Scott Barry Kaufman's a professor at Columbia University in New York City, and he took to Abraham Maslow's famous work on self-actualization back from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and he reupholstered it using contemporary positive psychology and personality psychology. And the book, really, really struck me. Then this is before I really went into the depths of doing a PhD. And so I still had a lot to learn about how to do good psychological or social science research. But the idea of self-actualization, we have this need to fulfill our potential really deeply resonated with me. And so that's how I decided to study self-actualization as a part of my PhD and take the first tentative steps towards identifying, what are the factors that might enable individuals to self-actualize and fulfill their potential within the workplace context too. Anyway, so that's my big long origin story. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear. And so I have a couple of questions coming out of that. So maybe I'll put them both out there, but we could tackle them one at a time. One is I'm curious to learn a little bit more about what someone maybe with a PhD in organizational behavior does, or what the research looks like there, or what an intervention might look like. But then second one, the natural question will maybe be like, well, what are the three steps to self-actualization, right? Not, yeah, that's that simple. But so
I
maybe,
wish it was.
yeah, maybe we can start just on the organizational behavior side, because even that basic model you mentioned of like, you have an individual in a system, and that kind of connection determines behavior in an organization. It's like, okay, I get that, but get a little deeper there in terms of, say, you have a PhD in organizational behavior. Are you going in and almost being like a psychologist, like telling people how to do things? Are you doing big interventions in the ways of working and then studying that? Like, what's sort of the actual work that goes with that discipline?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I can only speak to the research that I'm doing so far.
Sure.
There is certainly potential to be able to go into organizations and conduct interventions like that. So, alongside doing my PhD back home in New Zealand, I was developing leadership development programs that were looking at Indigenous Māori perspectives on human potential and leadership within the workplace context in New Zealand. And I was designing leadership development programs based on that. And I was working with individuals one to one in terms of doing coaching with them to help them find their pathway and figure out where they wanted to go long term. So I was trying to take a practical approach that was informed by research and molding together the research with the practical application. Because, I mean, the last thing that I want to do with my research is be, someone that's got a piece of paper that tells the world that they're smart, but they don't know how to be able to bridge this into practical language for everyday people as well. But in terms of my own research, I'm not doing any big interventions. I'm just doing a PhD at this stage. And the reason is because this idea of self-actualization, all of us have kind of heard about it if we've done introduction to management studies or we've done an introduction to social psychology or something like that. And we learn about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the big pyramid where self-actualization, the desire to fulfill your potential sits atop the hierarchy or the pyramid. I was reading all of Maslow's stuff as a part of my basic literature review right at the beginning of my PhD. And this question kept on coming back to me over and over and over again, which was actualizing towards what? Like, what is the standard? What is the reference point that individuals use to discern whether they're fulfilling their potential or not? Because if I want to go into organizations and conduct some sort of intervention that helps people fulfill their potential, I need to find a good way of measuring or capturing whether they perceive that they're fulfilling their potential or not. And I was looking at all of the different ways of measuring self-actualization or trying to discern whether someone is self-actualizing or not. And they were all kind of a bit crap. And I didn't buy them. And so this question kept on coming back to me, actualizing towards what? Actualizing towards what? And I wanted to figure out the answer to this question, not just for, an academic sense, but for my own sense too, because my research wasn't just research, it was me search. I was trying to figure out how do I fulfill my potential and what do I aim for in order to be able to guide myself and operate as a standard for fulfilling my potential. And if you read Maslow's work or some of the other self-actualization scholars, they use this really, nice and poetic language like an individual expresses their innate potential. Okay, well, how do I know what my innate potential is? You know what I mean? Your potential is something that is essentially imagined, or it's something that you kind of envision, but it's not something that you can objectively know for certain. Like you can't go in and take some sort of DNA test or something like that where some biologist or a psychologist says, Jackson, your potential is this, and this is what you should be doing with your life. That's something that you can't know, right? Which creates a lot of trouble for discerning whether someone's self-actualizing or not. Well, Maslow, for example, talks quite a bit about, the importance of expressing your true self or your authentic self, and that becoming the pathway or the standard for self-actualization. Sounds really nice. I love that sort of language. But if you really press it, it's like, well, how do I know whether what I'm pursuing is a true self as opposed to a false self? And if Maslow outlines like very clearly, how do you know whether you're pursuing a true self or a false self? Well, I mean, I'd be fine with that. But I didn't. There was just this kind of like nice sounding, but a little bit of airy fairy language. And so that was the beginning of my PhD journey. As I had all of these questions, and to be honest, I had an MBA behind me, but an MBA is really practitioner oriented instead of research oriented. And so I had these questions, and to be honest, I was almost asking like, am I just stupid and am I not like getting it when I'm reading this sort of stuff? But it turns out for me, that was the fundamental issue when it comes to a lot of self-actualization research, is that we've all been taught about it, we've all heard about it, and it sounds really nice and promising. But when it comes to actually discerning what it is that the self actualizes, or what it is that we use as a guide for discerning whether we're fulfilling our potential or not, no one's really hit the nail on the head for labeling what it is or how we navigate that process. And so that took me to a couple of different pathways that I started playing with. The first one was I was reading quite a bit of developmental psychology, and I spotted in that book that I originally told you that I read called Transcend, The New Science of Self-Actualization. Scott Barry Kaufman cited a scholar called Torrance. Torrance was a really famous developmental psychologist that was interested in what were the factors that enabled the development of creativity in children throughout adolescence into early adulthood. And he did an incredible long-term study that went for about 30 to 40 years, where he followed a group, I think it was of from childhood, a group of maybe about 200 to 300 people. And he was measuring them on a variety of different things, their IQ, for example, their socioeconomic factors, for example, yada, yada, yada. And he found the one thing that most significantly predicted creative achievement in later years in adulthood was the degree to which, as a young individual, they fell in love with an image of their future. It's pretty interesting, right? That really struck me as quite interesting. So, what did it matter for creative achievement? It wasn't whether you ended up at Harvard. It wasn't, how intelligent you were. It was falling in love with an image of your future. And this took me to the work of another developmental psychologist called Dan Levinson. Dan Levinson was a Yale psychologist that was around in the 70s, 80s, I think in the 90s as well. And he was very famous for a book that he wrote in the 1970s, 1978, I believe, called The Seasons of a Man's Life. And he also wrote a book called The Seasons of a Woman's Life as well in the mid to late 80s, 10 years afterwards. Now, he was interested in what are the stages that men and women go through as they're going through their development as a human person, through childhood, through adolescence, early adulthood, and then later on into emerging adulthood, and then becoming elderly and aging as well. And one of the critical stages that he identified, which was really, really similar, or at least had some really interesting resonance with what I just shared with you from Torrance, is he said that in early adulthood and adolescence, one of the critical developmental tasks with a lot of the individuals that he interviewed as a part of his studies was identifying your dream, your vision of who you could be as an adult in the world. And your dream it's a holistic picture of the life that you're living, the self that you're becoming. And in his studies, he suggested that men tend to be, and this isn't a hard and fast rule, these are rough tendencies across the sexes, is that men in their early years tend to be far more career oriented when it comes to their dreams, whereas women tend to be far more relationally oriented when it comes to their dreams. But regardless, he says in your adolescence and early adulthood, your dream kind of starts off as like a fuzzy idea of the mountain on the horizon that you dream to climb. But the critical task in early adulthood is defining that dream in greater clarity and getting really clear on your vision of the life that you want to live and the self that you want to be able to become. And it's a holistic picture. It's not just your career, it's not just your relationships, but it's your spiritual factors in there too. It's your relationship to your family, it's your contributions to your community. It's, what are you going to do in your in your downtime in terms of your leisure and your hobbies as well. So it's a really holistic picture of the life that you want to be living, not just in regards to your career, not just regards to your family, but the big picture stuff. And that's what took me to the research on what psychologists call possible selves. And possible selves are our images, are our ideas of who we could be in the future. So, for example, at a baseline, we have what I call our current self. Now, some other psychologists call this your real self or your actual self. I prefer the term current self because it's just your appraisal of who you are right now. And hopefully that appraisal is honest and accurate. You're not deceiving yourself. You're actually looking in the mirror and you're saying, Jackson, who am I right now? It's your kind of stock take of, your attributes, your traits, your strengths, your weaknesses. You're looking in the mirror and saying, this is who I am as I currently stand. And this is like your baseline comparison point for who you could become in the future. And this is when I came across research on what other psychologists call ideal selves, which is a subtype of a possible self. Your possible selves are your ideas of who you could be in your future, but your ideal self is the self that you, Jackson, or whoever else really dream of becoming in the future. It's your vision of yourself fulfilling your potential, right? Of really living the life and becoming the person that you want to be able to be. And my argument as a part of my PhD research is that that's your standard. That's your guide for self-actualization. It's not about digging around in here and trying to find the mystical true self. It's you reflecting on who do I really want to become and striving towards that. And so you experience self-actualization based on my framing in two different ways. When you perceive over time that you're growing towards becoming your ideal self, right? Let's say you reflect on the last 10 years of your life, but you can also experience self-actualization in the moments, right? So Jackson, for example, was here having this conversation with me, and he's doing this happiness PhD podcast. And right now, in this moment, he is doing something that is aligned with him becoming the self that he wants to be in the future. And so, if I'm blessed enough and this conversation is meaningful enough for Jackson, then Jackson might be self-actualizing in this moment in conversation with me because he's having a conversation that is aligned with him becoming the self that he wants to be in the future, right? So that's my argument for that's the standard for self-actualization is your sense of becoming or enacting, making progress towards being or becoming your ideal self. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was really well explained, honestly, because I feel like sometimes self-actualization, and maybe you kind of hit it on the hinted at this, can be sort of like, yeah, like okay, I want to fully, authentically express the best version of myself, and it's like, well, does that mean you need to go become like a interpretive dancer, or
Yeah.
should you be running an investment bank? So there's a pretty wide range. So I like that. I guess if I hear your construct correctly, it's saying that based on sort of maybe your, and we could get more into this, but based on your sort of values and goals that are perhaps intrinsically important and fulfilling to you, you can craft an image of an ideal future self. And then as you move along a trajectory toward that ideal self, that's experiencing that psychologically beneficial state of self actualization.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly it, right? That's exactly it. So we use that as our guide for fulfilling our potential. And so the research on ideal selves is pretty interesting because it suggests, and you touched on this in your recap just then, you did really well with it, is that your ideal selves are informed by three things. And those three things are your own sense of purpose or what's meaningful or your own sense of your calling in life, right? So your ideal self is in some ways your vision of who you would need to be to successfully enact your sense of purpose or calling in the world, right? So for you, Jackson, if you want to be a top podcaster in this space, I mean, we've only just met, so you can tell me if this is not true. But if you want to be like an incredible podcaster in this space, that part of your ideal self, and you want to be able to interview interesting people that have something to say about, how do we live happy and fulfilling lives, then the question would be, Jackson, who do you need to become in order to be able to do that? And that would be part of your ideal self. The part of it is your own sense of purpose and calling, and who do you need to become in order to enact that calling. The second one is your own sense of your values or your life philosophy for what it means to live and guide a good life and fulfill your potential. So, calling, values, and life philosophy. But then the other interesting one is that it's also influenced by your social identity groups that you belong to, right? That make up who you are, whether it's your family, whether it's communities that you're a part of, whatever, but also the social identity groups that you aspire to belong to as well. So, for example, when I go back home to New Zealand, I want to be one of the top scholars in my home country in this field in organizational behavior. I'm certainly not there right now. But my vision of me becoming and hanging out with that echelon of scholars influences my idea of my ideal self. So those three factors feed in to your ideal self. Okay. But your ideal self exists across multiple different domains, just like Dan Levinson talks about when it comes to your dream, too. So, what I do is I get people to describe who is your ideal self when it comes to your work and career, right? But that's not the only part of myself that's important, right? What about in regards to your friends and your family? What about in regards to your own, I don't know, spiritual or religious orientations? What about in regards to your leisure and hobbies? What about in regards to your contributions to your community as well? So it's a multifaceted vision of the self that you wish to be able to become. But the other element amidst all of this too is that we have our ideal selves, sure, but the research tells us that the biggest impediment for individuals to fulfill their potential is what psychologists call the ought self, OUGHT. And this is the self that others expect you to be, whether it's expectations from your family, whether it's expectations from society. Because Jackson is a man, he needs to do this, right? Or because Ryan's from New Zealand, he needs to act in this way. Right? And we heavily internalize these expectations, but sometimes they don't necessarily represent the self that we want to become. And so when I'm working with individuals, the reframe that I try to do is that there's a big difference between who others want you to be and who you want to be for others. Okay? So our ideal self is our standard for fulfilling our potential, but sometimes the expectations of others that we don't actually want to be able to live up to, or we don't necessarily feel are important parts of ourself, can be the biggest impediments for us fulfilling our potential.
Well, and there's probably more we can dive into on that part specifically, but curious to get your reaction to this because I feel like as I listen to that, I could almost see, I tend to think probably to a fault at times, but I tend to be very like protocol, framework, action oriented. And I almost feel like there's like a protocol I could see coming out of this conversation of saying, okay, one prescription, which is maybe a dangerous word to use because we're not being that heavy handed, right? But, one prescription to happiness would be, or, to supporting your overall happiness might be identifying with, so doing some reflection and contemplation around who is your ideal self, and maybe you break that down into some areas spiritually, relationship, work, whatever. And then you can sort of create almost that vision for the future, and then say, okay, now I'm going to assess like the three pathways to that. So
Mm.
I can think about, well, what is the type of work and role that I would need to do in order to move towards that? What are the sorts of qualities in my identity? So maybe I need to start being more assertive. And so then I can maybe create some sort of behavioral practice around doing something that makes me uncomfortable once a day. And then
Yeah.
the third one might be, well, what are the sorts of groups that I'd want to be a part of to align myself with that? Well, I want to be more spiritual, let's say, so I'm going to join the local Zen center. So I feel like I can start to see how, even though you're giving it in a theoretical way, it can get pretty practical and concrete where you say,
Yeah.
yeah, actually, if I just go do those three things, I'm going to be moving in a better direction. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I guess that's how I live after doing my PhD in this space is, every day I kind of think about in terms of my own personal protocol. Before I go to sleep, I plan out my day, and the core question that guides my day is how do I actualize my ideal self tomorrow? Right? And today, so far, that's been focusing on making progress on my PhD because hopefully I've only got a couple of months left on this thing and then I can put it away, right? But then later on tonight, I'm married and I love my wife, and part of me actualizing and being my ideal self is just being in relationship with her and being fully present with her and just going on a walk and getting some nice things to eat and calling it a day after that as well. But it's always this question of how do I use my days? How do I use my moments in a way which is aligned with me becoming my ideal self? I can answer that for me. Couldn't answer that for Jackson because we all have different ideal selves that we use as our guide for our potential as well. And so when I'm working with clients one to one on this sort of stuff, I'm always asking questions to help them get clear on what their vision of their future self, their ideal self that they wish to become looks like. And then it's a matter of, so what are you going to do tomorrow? Right? Because as I was saying before, yeah, we're getting a little bit theoretical, and I was giving you the
Yeah.
big backstory beforehand, but we experience self-actualization over that long-term developmental period, but also when we're living in alignment on a day-to-day basis with that self that we want to be able to become.
Mhm. Okay. Well, okay. So, and I do want to get back to this questions about the ought self, but I think this is a good point to ask. I think a tough question that I sometimes struggle with. Granted, I don't have as thorough of a research background. A lot of my sort of happiness frameworks are a little bit more like, a popular science summary of
Yeah,
things.
yeah,
But I think it's still valid for either. I sometimes try to think about like, look, I could just do all those things you mentioned pretty darn easily. But if I were, say, a single mom pulling back to back shift work at the tire plant and the local grocery store in order to just make ends meet, you could say, like, well, I'm like not even in a position to do anything about this. Or maybe even something slightly less dramatic, right? You could think of someone who's just saying, like, well, I don't know if this job's right for me, but I've got $80,000 of student loans to pay off, and I am getting engaged next month. And so we've got wedding costs coming up. And it's like, I don't feel like I'm able to just say, oh, I want to design my day to perfectly self actualize every day.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
what do you say when you're faced with those sorts of maybe, environmental, socioeconomic challenges?
Yeah, beautiful. Great question. It's all about progress in any capacity, right? So the research on happiness and the research on goal progression and the research within the context of ideal selves suggests that the important component is making perceived progress towards realizing meaningful goals. And if we think about our ideal self, it's almost like the master goal. It's like the top of the mountain. And if we're clear on our ideal self, then we can get a sense of what are the goals that I need to be focusing on in order to make progress towards becoming that ideal self in any capacity. Right. So when we're in those sorts of positions where, we can't design our days perfectly to be able to take a seat back for 3 hours and read some profound texts about and reflect on who's my ideal self and who do I want to become, that's not necessarily what I'm advocating for. There is some interesting research that suggests that just sitting down for 15 minutes and writing about your vision of who you could be in the future, let's say in 5 years' time, if everything went really, really well for you and you were fulfilling your potential and becoming the self that you wanted to be, if you just wrote that down for 15 minutes, there is research that suggests that people that do that for 4 days in a row, just by the prospect of experiencing that sense of inspiration and joy of visualizing that positive future has incredible benefits for our own sense of happiness just from really writing it through and visualizing it and really teasing it out. And we can then use that as a basis for making small pieces of progress every single day, right? And so for the individual that might be struggling as a single mom and making ends meet in one way or another, the question would be, how is that aligned with your sense of becoming your ideal self? Maybe your ideal self is being an incredible mother for your children, right? And being able to give them an incredible foundation as well as you can within your circumstances. And so that imbues those actions on a day-to-day basis with a greater sense of meaning, right? And a greater sense of, I guess, an opportunity for self-actualization because you understand how those things align with you becoming your ideal self. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, absolutely. It reminds me even of like the cognitive crafting and job
Yeah.
crafting, right? Where even if it's like, let's say, yeah, a role where obviously there's a big spectrum of roles from being like me, I run two my own companies versus being working on an assembly line, right? There's a wide degree of the extent to which you can sort of craft or shape your day to day work. But even just that simply kind of connecting back the work you're doing with the values that are important to you and your
Yeah.
ultimately your long-term goals, it may not still be the ideal work, but it can be that sort of sense of progress.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? So how does this make sense within the context of me moving towards becoming that ideal self?
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the important things that I haven't mentioned yet is that it's also important to recognize that your ideal self changes over time as well. So the research suggests that your ideal self changes across different life stages and periods in your life. So, for example, I was sharing with you before my undergraduate studies, even though they were a piece of crap, my rock star dream and my ideal self was becoming the mayor of my hometown in little old New Zealand. I'm not going to be running for mayor anytime soon, right? But that doesn't mean that I failed at self-actualization in any capacity, right? That just means that that North Star of me becoming my ideal self served a really important function as guiding me to another pathway that I wanted to be able to pursue. So your vision of your ideal self is always changing over time as well as we attempt to actualize towards it, right? That doesn't mean that it radically changes on a day-to-day basis. It's across different stages in our life. Like if I went home and my wife suddenly told me, Ryan, I'm pregnant, my ideal self is probably going to change as a function of that. You know what I mean? Pretty radically, okay? Because I'm going to have to focus on, listen, how do I provide for these kids and make sure that I'm an incredible father to them in any capacity too. So the ideal self is it's our standard for our potential that is always moving as we navigate towards it as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Awesome. Well, so I want to ask you about how that, especially maybe as an external person or leader, we can change that in an organization. But first, you mentioned something I found interesting with the ought self. And
Mm.
I'm always fascinated when one of my kind of, I guess, sub passions under happiness is kind of contemplative science. So when I see these convergences between spiritual and wisdom traditions and philosophy with modern psychology. And the ought self reminds me a lot of the work of Joseph Campbell, who he talks about this idea of you have to kill the dragon, thou shalt. And he talks a lot about in the sort of spiritual life that, you're going to have all these sort of burdens, or even Nietzsche, I think, has an analogy of you go out into the desert as a camel, you're holding these burdens, all the expectations and weights of society, and then you turn into a lion that kills the camel, kills all those burdens, and then you become the child, which is just sort of doing its own thing in awe of life. So I think there's a lot of motifs around the ought self. And I also learned last year about mimesis, which I don't know if you've come across this concept, but you might find it interesting. It's from Rene Girard, who is a Stanford psychologist, and he talks a lot about how we sort of construct our wants based on social dynamics, right? Like, why are diamonds so valuable, right? Well, it's because I know everyone else
Everybody
wants
else
them.
has
Or
them.
it's
Yeah.
like the girl or guy who plays hard to get, and all of a sudden you like them more. So I guess this question is gets at it's a long-winded way of asking, how do we deal with that ought self, or
Mm.
maybe how do we balance? Because I know Gabor Mate talks about there's a tension sometimes between authenticity and attachment, or excuse me, authenticity and attachment, right? It's like I could just deny everyone's expectations and do whatever the heck I want, but that might actually be somewhat damaging. So
Yeah,
how do you
yeah, yeah.
navigate the role of the pressure of oughts and shoulds and expectations?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's one of the things, the ideal self, in my eyes, is an incredibly under-researched construct. And I think all individuals have ideal selves, but we aren't all necessarily aware of them, right? We all have dreams for our future. All have goals that we're pursuing that are hopefully going to help us fulfill our potential and become the people that we want to be. But the way that this operates can be different across different cultures as well. So some of the research from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who's famous for his work on flow, he suggests that individuals in individualistic contexts, right, where they're operating predominantly in the Western world and individuals are far more individualistic, he argues that for those individuals, the ideal self can be far more salient for them, right? And so they pursue self-gratifying tasks, right? It's all about who do I want to become? Where do I want to go? But the danger to that is that without considering others around you, it can just be like a really individualistic pursuit of self-fulfillment that's not attached to anybody else around you as well. But on the flip side, in collectivist cultures that have far more of an emphasis on relationality and connection to others and everything like that, the ought self can be far more salient and far more of an impediment to individuals fulfilling their potential too. I had a client of mine recently, or was a friend of mine that I was talking with recently, and he said, I was talking to him about the ought self, and he said, I've heard about this before, but it was, I hadn't heard it said to me as the ought self. A friend of mine said to me once, don't should on me and I won't should on you, which is probably a less sophisticated way of the Joseph Campbell
Yeah.
quote that you were saying before. But that's why I think the question that I shared before, which is it's not a matter of who do others want you to be, but who do you want to be for others, is a really helpful way of reframing that. So you're not carrying that burden of this is what other people expect of me. And by no means am I saying that we should reject all of those expectations. But if they're not representative of the self that we want to become, then we've got to be really cautious about them. And so, one activity that I can recommend people doing, or a protocol to be able to use your language, is just like write down all of your identities, right? That you think that make who you are. Jackson is a young man, right? Or Jackson is a father. I don't know if you are or not, or whatever it is, yada, yada, yada. And write down, because I am a man, my family expects me to, or society expects me to X, right? And fill that out in whatever way that you think strikes you, based on making sense of the expectations other people have for you. And then on your own terms, say, because I am a man, this is what I expect of myself. Right? So you get clear on the discrepancy or the potential overlap or the differences between who you are today, society expects you today, and what you actually want for yourself based on who you are and the identities that you sense make up who you are as well. Right? One of the things that I think is a potentially interesting way for thinking about this further, especially because I'm not advocating that we reject all the expectations other people have for others, but as far as I'm aware, in the Hindu tradition, some of the research on ideal selves use the word dharma. Right? In the Hindu tradition, your dharma is like your sacred pathway. Now, listen, I'm probably butchering this a little bit because I'm not a Hindu theologian or anything like that.
Sure.
But my understanding is that within the Hindu context, we have our own personal dharma, which is our sacred pathway, but we also have dharmas in relationship to others around us as well. And I was talking to one of my friends based here at Harvard about this, and he said, yeah, and one of the things that you do when you're navigating the tensions between those dharmas you have for your own personal pathway, your ideal self, and your own dharmas you have in relationship to others, which could be ought selves, is you navigate the two to see which third way emerges. And that's the pathway you should pursue. So I wonder, I haven't seen any empirical research on this, but it'd be really interesting to see what happens for people's sense of happiness and well-being when their ideal self and ought self, when they find alignment between the two, and they can pursue those pathways as their standard for their potential. Now, my research, I haven't published it, I'm still completing my PhD, but it shows clearly that if individuals feel like they're close to their ideal self and they're making progress towards becoming their ideal self, they're way happier, right? And not only are they happier, they're far more engaged within the workplace context as well. So for me, the ideal self is a really important standard that we can use to be able to live more happy and fulfilled lives and to be able to fulfill our potential. But I don't want to reject the ought self altogether, right?
Yeah.
I want to be able to think through, right? How do we create that sense of overlap? Because if we're doing is paying attention to those ought selves, well, the research suggests that it kind of feels a little bit soul crushing because all you're doing is living up to the standards of others without attending to what's meaningful and important and invigorating for you.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, and I'm curious then, what how might you approach this? Let's call it, I'm thinking again a little bit selfishly that I, consult and train in organizations. I do some coaching, but I think this could apply to someone who's even just thinking about their own work or their own workplace. I'm almost thinking about like how do you embed this into an organization or team, and particularly because like change is hard, right? I know
Mm,
from my work, we've trained about 15 different battalions in the military, and it's like they say, "Oh, that was an amazing training." But if we were to check in later, I think sometimes it's like, "Oh, yeah, we were supposed to start doing more of X, but we just got so busy." So I guess if you were designing, yeah, kind of trying to build this into the leadership development of an organization, let's say,
yeah.
even right now, we're thinking about it for I am helping run all the kind of leadership development for a sales office. Like, how would you start to try to systematize or weave this into the kind of fabric of how that group works to make it
Yeah.
real?
Yeah, so there's plenty of research on this and how to apply this within when it comes to change, not only for personal change in terms of trying to fulfill your potential, but also trying to enact change within organizations or across communities as well. And there's a really clear 5-step process. Okay, and this comes from the research from Richard Boyatzis, one of the leading scholars in this field. He says that when it comes to seeking to fulfill your potential and realize your ideal self, and we have ideals as individuals, but we also have them as organizations as well in terms of our visions for the future and where our organization wants to go. So we don't need to just be thinking about this for ourselves. We can think about this in the organizational context too. The first step, he says, is getting really clear on your ideal self, right? Says do some sort of visioning exercise, whether it's you as an individual writing out for 15 minutes. If I was really fulfilling my potential in 5 years, what would this look like across all of the different parts of my life? But equally, it could just be a visioning exercise in an organizational context with a team as well. Let's say you get the team of 10 in or whatever it is, right? Where do we want to be in 5 years' time? What is it going to look like for us as an organization if we were really fulfilling our potential, doing the work and having the impact that we wanted to be able to have? First, you need to get clear on that vision, okay? And then the second part is honestly confronting your current self or where you stand today as an individual or as within an organization context as well. And that looks like, taking an honest stock take of your strengths. What do we got that are our strengths that are going to help us actualize this ideal that we're moving towards? What are our shortcomings or our potential weaknesses or where we need to be able to up our game to be able to move towards that as well? What are our habits that we're removing that help us move towards that? Where do our habits need to improve, right? What are the traits and the characteristics that we have that are going to help us there, right? What are the traits and characteristics that we have that are potentially holding us back? So we use that standard as we use the ideal self as the standard that are going to prompt us and inspire us to create that change. And then we've got to honestly confront our reality where we are right now, whether it's who we are as an individual or who we are as a team or a group. The third step is then mapping forward our pathways to be able to bridge that gap, whether it's outlining our own learning and development agenda or outlining potential pathways that we could use to be able to move forward and climb that mountain, so to say. Step one, identify the ideal self. Step two, confront the current self. Step three, outline the gaps and the plans to be able to move in between the two. The fourth is then just experimenting with those pathways to move forward. And it's important that it's experimentation, right? Because then you can see which pathways seem the most promising once we start playing with them, once we start treating them, once we start walking them. And then amidst that, the fifth step, and this is more of a step that is important across each of these different phases, is identifying the individuals, the groups that are going to help sustain you on this journey or going to help guide you on this journey as well. So this might be, let's say Jackson, for example, becoming a podcaster extraordinaire or something like that. That might be, learning from other people that are really successful in this space. That also could be, hanging out with friends who just really give you the energy that you need to be able to do the good work that you're doing. It might be finding a really good partner to be able to work with when it comes to your consulting work as well. It might be, having a husband or a wife or something like that, that is someone to come home to love you and support you on your journey too. The part of it is also having the resonant relationships that help sustain you on each step of that journey as well. So you can embed that when it comes to your own personal change. You can embed that within organizational context. You can apply that within community context as well. And those are the pathways to iterate towards change. And the thing is, it's not a journey that ever finishes. It's about the continuous progress and reevaluation and growth and momentum that comes.
Right. I love that. The five, sort of a five-step framework there, right? Yeah. So ideal self, current reality, and then it was looking at basically ways to move in that positive direction, experiment and iterate, and then along the way finding supportive groups to kind of without did I get it right?
Yeah, you got
Okay.
it. Bang on, bang on.
Got it. Well, Brian, I appreciate this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to you for the end here. tell people if you have, personal profiles to share, recommended reading, how they can learn more about you, and then as well, if you have anything else that we didn't get a chance to talk about, feel free to share that too.
Yeah, sure, sure. I think the one thing that I haven't talked about, which I think is really important to share, is one of the other possible selves that we have is also our feared self, which is the self that we want to avoid becoming. And my research demonstrates that feared selves can also be really important catalysts for change,
Mm,
but they're not sufficient standards for guiding long-term change. And the way that I want to explain it is that it's like, let's say, for example, you grew up in a hometown that you didn't like. Now, this is not me. I love my little hometown in New Zealand, right? But it's like you're always running away from your hometown that you hated without arriving somewhere that you ever want to properly call home, right? All that does for you, running away, can provide you a sense of relief, but it's not going to be a sufficient standard for progress towards a meaningful goal, which is one of the pathways towards sustainable happiness, right? So the reason that I share that is because one of the things that I commonly have with coaching clients that I have is they'll come to me and they'll have a feared self. They don't label it that, but they'll say something like, can't stand the idea of being in this workplace anymore, right? It's crushing my soul. I can't cope with it anymore. I need to get out. That's a feared self. But the work that I do is helping them reappraise that in a way that helps them clearly articulate their ideal self, right?
mm,
And it's almost like I share a metaphor of almost having like a compass in front of your hand. And the feared self is a really powerful arrow that orients us away from the self we don't want to be. But that's not sufficient, right? So we need to be able to build our other arrow on our compass, which is who do we want to become and where do we want to go long term as well. So I think that's also really important to add to this conversation because I'm sure we've all got feared selves and ideas of who we don't want to become, but we don't want to just be using those as a guide in and of themselves. Beyond that, um, I am here in the United States for another month on my Fulbright scholarship before I return home to New Zealand. So I'll be starting off as an academic back home in New Zealand, and I'll continue to be doing coaching work and consulting work, operating in this space for helping people fulfill their potential and live happy and fulfilling lives. That's my sense of calling and purpose in the world. And if anyone's interested in getting in contact with me, you can find me on LinkedIn and um, hopefully one day I might have a book out this about this further along the line, but I'm just at the beginning of my own journey. My ideal self is being pretty good in this space in say like 10, 15 years time. So hold the fire on the book.
awesome. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Ryan. It's been a pleasure to talk to you here about this, intersection of self-actualization, potential, and happiness. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me.